So the next session is with a group of Figmates. And this is one that is built off of last year's talk by Sho Kuwamoto on why we build what we build. And that's about the care that goes into each thing and why we make some of the decisions that we make. And a little bit maybe of a call for all of us to make sure that we're thinking through all those decisions. The group got together and thought about what are some of the principles they've been thinking about, what are some of the ways that they made decisions, some of the things that you saw released today, and some of the things that you've seen, or yesterday, that you've seen more recently, or before that. So joining Sho is Marcel Weekes, VP of Engineering, Ginny Wen, Design Manager, and Katie Szeto, one of our product managers. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
All right. Hello, everybody. All right. So Andrew asked me to come participate in this a few weeks ago, and he said we're going to do this thing. It's going to be based on this talk he gave last year. He gave this talk called "Why Do We Build What We Build?" and there's principles, and we try to work through that and so on. And I think the reason why something like this, at least to me, I think is interesting, is because people come up to us all the time and ask us about product and why did you make this decision? Why did you make that decision? How do you operate? How do you, and so we practiced. And then as we practiced, what we found was, these guys, they're, I love working with all of them. They're so kind, they're so thoughtful, and they're damnedest to give like a really thoughtful, correct answer. And they were just like, well, we prioritize our thing, and the more they practiced and the more the better they were trying to do, the more boring it got, And I said, I'm just going to throw them curveballs. And I just started in practice, I just started asking them just random questions they weren't expecting, whatever. And then the answers got better. So we're going to run with that. And so I'm going to do my best to try to draw good answers from these folks that you might want to hear. And then the thing that you guys can do to help us is if you could provide a supportive environment here so that they feel comfortable just being themselves, riffing, whatever, right? Okay, so that's the situation, okay? And so we're going to rename this talk from why do we build what we build to tough questions with Sho. And so, all right, okay. See? Thank you for being such a supportive audience. It's going to work. This is going to be amazing. Okay, so I'm going to ask, I think, a little bit of a softball. No wrong answers, right? So all of you were somewhere else before coming to Figma, right? So when you came to Figma and you started getting to know how we work and so on, is there anything that struck you as being really different than what you were used to? And just raise your hand if you want to go. Okay, Marcel.
All right, I'll jump in. In the spirit of the Sho said, I'm going to go for it. So prior to Figma, I was at Slack for 6 years. I had gone through a bunch of redesigns and different work there. And one of the things that really struck me when I got to Figma was that even though Slack is known for craft and really puts in a lot of attention and time, detail on things, Figma was doing sort of that with a level of fearlessness that I was not accustomed to. And I'd say a story that sort of epitomizes this for me is our recent redesign, which you've seen yesterday unveiled as UI3. As part of that, we really got into the properties panel, which is where designers spend a fair chunk of their time. And inside there's a lot of decisions to be made about what goes in. And we were having a conversation about information density and this product review and what should go where. And I remember leaving the product review when it was over, coming back, and in the channel where we had started the product review, there was a conversation still going on in a thread that must have been about 100 messages deep at this point about what information belonged there and why. And as I was reading through that, I realized that the tension that was ultimately beneath that question was around how much of the workflow of what users were doing were we considering with what we considered like a redesign. And I've been places where a redesign is a fresh coat of paint, but in this case, it was much more about we're going to reconsider workflows at the user level. And everyone here has probably been a part of a redesign. Those things are scary. They can sort of go out of control. You can end up in a spot where it's sort of everyone's pet project or pet itch is getting thrown into this, and it doesn't really launch on time or really land with effect. And this is why I say it was with a bit of fearlessness, like really willing to go after the workflows. So that's one of the things that really struck me about coming.
So just to challenge that a little bit, or maybe challenge or follow on or something. The tough question. So it's one thing to say, oh, I got to Figma and they're so fearless. It's amazing, but obviously there's.
Did it sound just like that? Was that
that interview question, like, what's your biggest weakness? And you're like, oh, I'm a perfectionist, like, what do you do differently at Figma? We're fearless, like there's a plus and a minus to everything, right? So, somebody else might look at that and say, man, they don't know how to run a tight ship here, because there's, they were trying to do a redesign, and in the middle of the redesign, they're questioning these basic things, and they're like scope creep and like all this other stuff is being brought into it. Like is that, how do you do that without it getting out of control?
Yeah, and I think there's some, I guess, effectively guidelines that the team's adhering to as part of this. But for me, one of the things is those guidelines that initially appeared unspoken. Like I didn't understand where those guidelines were. I had to dig in and ask around. But I think part of this is based on intuition that people have built up over time, but also based in research, information that people have gotten about what are the actual problems we're trying to solve. And once you sort of identified that set, then you can sort of have this filter of, is this addressing the problem or not? Or is this addressing one of our core problems or not? But I use fearlessness I use that advisedly. Some people might just call it the audacity or sort of the ridiculousness of trying to take on too much. I do think there's a tension there.
Yeah. So Jenny, you're on the design team, right? And you were a different part of the design team, so you weren't directly working on UI3, but you saw it.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So how does the design team think? Well, so this is different projects are run differently at Figma. Some are more driven by product management, some are more driven by design. And I would say that UI3 was more driven by design than product management.
Yeah.
So how does the design team think about things like when it's a good idea to open the floodgates and when it's a good idea to close it down?
I don't know if we have principles around that necessarily. But also going back to your earlier question around like what was something that's surprising about Figma. One nice thing that we do is that when we're like, one of my first projects, it was in the sharing panel, for example, and I had to like fix one setting or something. But one thing that I was delighted by was we fixed that one setting, but then I was like, oh, there's some there's some inconsistencies in here. And then the product manager I was working with at the time she was just like, yeah, we're already in there. Let's fix it. Right. So I don't think there's like principles around like when to pull back or when not to do something, but often we're like, hey, the marginal cost of actually just making this whole area a little bit nicer is so low, and we're already in there. We're already in the code base. We're already touching the service and thinking about it. So why not just go that little step better to make things better in this whole surface area? So I don't know if that's a principle, but that's a general practice that we do, I think.
Right. Like another thing I would say that characterizes, at least what I think of as Figma style, is we really rely on intuition a lot.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that later. We'll ask some questions around that. But I think one of the good things about intuition is a lot of us over the years, we develop a lot of insight, and sometimes we're afraid to use that intuition. And so really leaning into like, no, I really think we should do this, I think can be powerful, And then the flip side of it is because it's intuition, almost by definition, you can't write it down. You can't say like, well, what are the rules for the intuition, So it's tricky. And then for UI3 on the PM side, we had Casey, who on the PM team, who was the PM for that project. And I'm trying to calibrate whether I should say this or not. He's like, he's not the best project manager, that's that's not like, no, he's great. He's amazing. But that's not a superpower. His superpower is, he's an ex-designer, and he's really, really in tune with, working with designers, what really matters, what doesn't matter or whatever. And so that's why he was the right person for that job, And so he was able to give that team a lot of breathing room in the right places and then not in the right places, and so on and so on. So that was another factor. Katie, on the enterprise side, okay, so, we make decisions about things. Are there any like decisions that come to mind that on the enterprise side that could help shed light on how you think about things?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of how we make decisions in the enterprise area, I am afraid that this will come off as overly, simplistic or maybe naive, but my answer is really just talk to customers. I'm, in the fortunate position where we're dealing with enterprise accounts. There's few enough of them, and I often am talking to the organization admins, so there's even fewer. And so that means I can actually develop meaningful relationships with these people over time. And so talking about intuition, the way I develop my intuition is really just talking with these customers and trying to understand what is causing pain and why. And that's really, how I develop that intuition and how we prioritize. And I love telling this story, but that's literally how the enterprise plan was born. So I think many of you in this room probably know it launched around 2 years ago. And what that came from was an onboarding project. So I walked into Figma and my manager said, hey, we have some pretty large customers and I'm pretty sure we're, underserving them in some way. Why don't you go, talk to them and see what happens? So in my first few weeks, I just kicked off this series of customer interviews, and that was literally how the enterprise plan was born. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sho, but that's what I got.
Yeah. And then when it comes to decision making around projects, so there's like big projects, there's little projects, and there can be different processes that make sense for them. And then the bigger it is, the harder maybe some of these decisions get, whether to even do it or what direction to go in, kind of thing. And so, Jenny was the lead designer on FigJam, and she also oversaw that part of the organization for slides. And so those are like two really big 1.0,
Yep.
right? And then so tell me, how did you even decide to do it? And how did you decide like what direction to go in, and how does that all happen?
Yeah. Again, I feel like there is no golden process or like something that we followed. But for FigJam specifically, like that started off around early in the pandemic, actually, when we were first seeing people using Figma actually for a bunch of activities. They were in Figma hanging out. They were in Figma having happy hours and whatnot, and they were brainstorming. And we were already seeing this sort of like activity happening in Figma, which was really interesting. But I think also at the same time, Dylan, our CEO, and Yuki, our CPO, they were thinking about like, hey, what is Figma's next product going to be? Because Figma already was pretty successful, and they were starting to think about like, what is next for this company? So there's a little bit of like top down, but also sort of like bottoms up emergence around this whole whiteboard space. And I remember early on in the project, it was just myself, a PM, a researcher, and one or two engineers actually who started prototyping and building stuff up. And it was a parallel process basically of us doing research, learning about people's needs, trying out concepts, but also at the same time, as we were thinking about those concepts and researching, engineers building it really actively. And we had this process of basically us just building something scrappy and then putting it on our internal staging instance, and then people trying it out and giving us feedback. And we basically felt our way through the entire product process just doing that in tight loops.
Yeah. And this is one thing where you actually pull this up. So, okay, so this is like a super early version of FigJam?
Super early FigJam. Those are people doing, I think it's a stand-up in there. There's like the ugly colors in there originally that I think an engineer just like slotted those in and was just like, let's play with these. But I mean, why not?
Should I go back and this?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
This
stuff is
that for the next part. Okay.
Yeah, we can also just talk about those too.
Okay. Well, anyway, okay. So keep going.
Yeah. So we just sort of did this cyclical thing where we were playing with prototypes of it internally. I think this is what FigJam actually looked like a few months before launch, and we were like, yeah, it's feeling pretty good. Let's launch it soon. But this thing happened actually where we showed the board early versions of FigJam. We were like, we're getting ready to launch. And then we got this question from one of the board members, and they were like, hey, what's really different about FigJam? And then Dylan was like, oh, FigJam is really fun. Like, for example, you see the slide on the right, like that's somebody in a stand-up and it's really fun because they're drawing and stuff like that. But then the board member was like, it doesn't quite feel that way yet. You know, it doesn't feel like you guys, like the culture inside of Figma that's making this new product. So basically we went back and we took that feedback and we just sort of were like, how do we really emphasize that? How do we make FigJam more fun? Because I think they were right. Like it was a lot of fun. It was bringing out a lot of like this fun ideative culture inside of our company, and people were having like more fun meetings using FigJam. So
I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm also going to offer some opinion / commentary in disguised as a question. Okay.
Kicks ready.
So, like, first of all, it's really hard to know what do you spend your time doing at a 1.0 because for everything you're doing, you're not doing something else.
Yep.
And so it seems insane to me that you pick fun, first of all. Like, you know, because like there's almost certainly something that's like a productivity enhancer or a something on a checkbox that, you know, for somebody's purchasing decision or whatever. So part one of my question, which is a multi-part question,
Ready.
is like, okay, why do you think that was, you know, good from your perspective? You know, and then the second is, I think it turned out great, but like when all this stuff was happening, I was really worried about this idea because I think baking fun into a product is like really, really hard. I think it's very easy to think you're building something fun, but then you build something that like is animated and annoying.
Yep.
You know? And so how do you actually make it fun as opposed to making it kind of like pretend fun?
Yep. Okay. I think in my head, I remember those questions. Okay. So first one about choosing something over other things.
What's good about choosing fun, for example, in this particular case?
Yeah. Well, I think with making anything that's 1.0, like I think you just have to throw away the notion that you're going to be able to get to feature parity or you're just going to get to the features that everybody wants. So you really just have to focus on like what is already good about it. And I think we were already finding that internally it was fun. People wanted to have fun. It was the middle of the pandemic and everyone was just craving for human interaction. And we were noticing that people were having it within this whiteboard, right? And so for us, it was like really, the trade-off was like, do we try to make ourselves as good at everything as everybody else, or do we lean into the thing that we're already really good at? And it's a risk, but that's what we did. So we chose fun and we leaned into it. And I think it could have turned out badly for sure. But the other part around how do you make it fun?
The reason I ask you is I think you're actually really good at this, you know, is you'll say, hey, I think this is too much, or I think let's do this more. Or whatever.
Yeah. So that's actually a thing that we were super conscious of as we were going through this process is like, I have experienced software many times where I'm like, it feels like it's trying too hard to be fun. It's throwing confetti in my face when I'm like changing the admin.
I'm really sorry. If anybody out there has software that literally has confetti, I'm really sorry.
Thank you for
now it sounds like I like I'm like, you know, making fun of that, but anyway, so okay.
Great.
Keep going.
So what we really tried to do was we said, hey, there are moments when people are already having fun. You know, we're already noticing people drawing, people writing text chats like on the canvas. How do we lean into those moments and emphasize them and just make people have more of those moments, or in those moments have more fun? So actually, if you go to the next slide, like one thing we did to try to make that very genuine is we made fake tweets around moments in which people would use these features. So we would capture a feeling. We'd say like, oh yeah, how would someone respond when they use cursor chat or when they use what's called high fives? And how are they going to feel? So we really emphasized those moments and those feelings, so we didn't lose sight of that. And so I think this is actually us trying out making these like emojis and stamping and cursor chat at the same time. And we would do this thing where we would just make these really hacky prototypes, and this is with a few engineers, and we would just go to people's meetings and we'd be like, okay, carry on and do your stand-up or your product review or whatever, and just try this thing out and see what happens. And they would use this, and it's sort of like the interactions are really broken. They don't make sense. Like someone literally is like, how do I chat? Like I literally don't know. But what we noticed is on Zoom, people would just be smiling as they are using these features. And so that just gave us hope, and it gave us signal that, hey, there's something good about this right now. The interactions aren't right, the features are maybe not right, but it's good. And there's a vibe here that's fun. And how do we just continue to ride this vibe and continue to develop features in this direction, even though not everything's right yet?
The thing I really liked about, it's sort of how you did this was number one, just sort of leading into what was working, right?
Yeah.
And then even if it was maybe a little counterintuitive or not logical, it was like, that's the stuff that was working, so get into it.
Yeah.
And then also just observing, so you were, I remember how you would just go to these rooms and just force these new features on people as they were having meetings, and then just watch what they did, which was great.
Yeah.
I want to pivot from decision making to execution. We don't have any more of these stuff, right? That's one.
I think it's just an image of FigJam. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go back. So anyway, in terms of execution, one thing that was coming to mind for me is we spent a lot of time on these AI features, and it was quite challenging for us to get them to where they are today. And probably there are people in the audience who are going through a similar journey in terms of AI, trying to figure out how do we put it into our product? What do we even, what are the touch points, or how does it work? And then executing on that. And so, Marcel, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we got to where we are with AI.
So it's a journey, and I don't think we're done with it at all yet. This is learning as we go, but I can share with you what we have learned so far. Initially, when sort of AI was becoming very prominent, we knew we were going to be incorporating it into the product, we decided to take an approach of let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, we figured every team uses databases. We have a centralized database team that provides basic functionality, and then product teams that leverage that. And we set it up very similarly for AI. We had sort of a centralized AI team that was taking care of some of the basic infrastructure, and then we let every team build upon that. And it became pretty clear within, I'd say, a number of weeks that all those teams were already oversubscribed. They all had like config deadlines, they were planning roadmaps, and they just didn't have the bandwidth to make progress against this. We weren't seeing traction. So we chose at that point to go a counterintuitive route and actually embed dedicated AI teams in each of our product pillars and just say, okay, you get to work on this. This is your area to deliver on. And we knew that would be inefficient. We knew there were some challenges in going that route, but it did allow us to actually make significant progress as those teams dug in. Some of the stuff you see in products today from our FigJam launch last year up until some of what was shown this week came out of teams that were dedicated to the design pillar or to the FigJam pillar. But this is a process, and we're moving forward. So one of the things we're actually doing now is going back to that original model of having a centralized team that's delivering on the infrastructure, but letting each of our product teams actually go ahead and explore this on their own. So before Sho hits me with the hard question of, so you just went back, why? Is because the world has changed a bit. And things are moving fast in AI, they're moving really fast, but when things first came out, we were reading papers literally every week and trying to figure out what was going on, and teams did not have the headspace for this. So now that we've sort of seen what we can do, and we figured out, not just from an engineering perspective, but from a product and design perspective, how do we talk about AI in our products, or what are the interfaces? How do we design for it? Our product teams have become much more immersed in it and can actually have the bandwidth to execute on this now. So we're moving back to that centralized model that delivers on the infrastructure, and then letting each product team that's closest to the problems really deliver on solutions here. Because we don't want to be in a world where we're delivering AI solutions just for the sake of AI. That's a little bit ivory tower, and we end up with like solutions looking for problems. We want to actually deliver on things that we think are removing some of the rote work that designers are doing with like content fill, or what you saw yesterday with like the drag and filling in the information. So that is a pivot that we have taken over the last few months with AI.
All right. Trying to look at time, see if we have time for one more before the last thing. I think I'm going to ask this open-ended question. I ask that to each of you, and I think that'll give us enough time for each person to answer. But I feel like one good way to think about an organization is to think about, who was I as a person when I joined the organization versus who am I now? And so if you were to take a time machine and go back and say, talk to the person you were when you joined to give them some advice for how they should operate, like what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I can hop in on this first, give you time to think. The advice I would give, I guess, my younger self is really to care less what other people think. I'm sure there's a lot of perfectionists out there in the audience. I'm a recovering one. And that was a lesson I had to learn the hard way. I think that's David. I can't quite tell. But we were talking at dinner the other night that the PM job is really hard because you're constantly operating at these two different altitudes. So there's the cosmic question of what should we be building and why, coupled with the question of, when can you fix this bug and should this button be blue or yellow? And so it's hard to get everything right as a PM and in any function, really. And so I think at Figma, I learned to recenter around, what actually matters. And what matters is not looking good in front of Dylan or Sho in the product review. What matters is, did you achieve the objective of the product review, which is maybe drive alignment on a particular strategic choice. And so I have learned, to adjust that internal scorecard. What matters is, am I moving things forward for my team? Are we picking a direction? Are we executing? Are we learning? And also, as awesome as I think I am, most people don't spend their free time thinking about me or what I did or what I said or what I didn't do. And so I think that is something I wish I had learned earlier, honestly.
Good. Marcel?
For me, going back to my younger self, I like that phrase. Thank you. I'll use it. I would, coming into Figma, I knew I was not a designer, but I knew that the empathy for designers and how they work was at the core of what was going on at Figma. And I thought I could take the approach of sort of working at the appropriate level of abstraction to operate within that world. And I think I would tell my earlier self, just go ahead and learn as much as you can about designers. Ask all the questions, annoy Sho have lunch with Sho every week and annoy him, which maybe that already happens. But I would do that and just ask tons and tons of questions, because that intuition that Sho mentioned, or that taste making, is something that it's really a shared context. And in order to play in that environment, you've got to share some of that knowledge.
Yeah. I was going to say, speaking of intuition, I think mine is to lean into my intuition more, because I think as a person, I actually am a very strong internal conviction kind of thinker, but I realized at work I actually wasn't, and I think also as a designer, you're so trained to be you need to back up every decision you make, with research, with data and whatnot. So I remember before working at Figma, it was so important to me to have those things, to do all those steps. And even if I had a strong feeling oh yeah, I think this is the right direction we need to go in, I still had to do those steps in order to feel oh yeah, I can make this argument to the people internally that this is the right direction. But I think at Figma, right, we are always working super hard to get that intuition, whether it's through research or through what we see in the community. And there is just a greater emphasis and sort of I want to say okayness about asserting your intuition, about saying, hey, I don't know yet, but I think this is the direction we need to go in, and I will be proven wrong later. And that, I think, has been really liberating to me, to be yeah, I am somebody who really likes listening to my internal intuition, and we can build product this way.
Yeah, well, you stole mine, so
Damn it.
I got to think of another one. So I'll riff on intuition a little bit, and I'll flip it around. But my background is actually, I was an engineering leader for most of my career. I was a vice president of engineering in my Macromedia days and so on. And I came to Figma originally to run engineering, not to be in product. And so when I switched from engineering to product, I really had this fetishization of the stuff that product management is supposed to do, and be metrics driven and have, clear goals and, this and that and whatever else. And I really had to unlearn some of that and trust my gut. And so, that was a process for sure, because it was something where I was entering a different discipline, and I really had to, it was doubly hard in my mind to trust my gut when I was sort of an interloper in this in this world. But anyway, so that was a learning. And then now as a leader, I think it's really hard to figure out how do you make room for that intuition, because intuition can be a world where the loudest voice wins, or the person who's highest in the org chart wins, or whatever. And really what you need is a culture where everybody is encouraged to be as in tune as possible with customers and the problems that they have and the product and the very detailed workings of the product, in order to then build that intuition about, okay, what are the opportunities? And then as a leader, it's actually really challenging to figure out how do you make room for intuition so that everybody can actually get that in there and throw it in. And how do you, because it's not like a democracy, and it's also not done through metrics. And if it's done through intuition, then how do you do that? And weirdly, I know I'm going to sound like I'm just plugging FigJam, but I'm not, is the way that we use that in meetings actually helps a ton, because we have this weird ritual where a lot of times at the beginning of the meetings, we actually are completely silent and we're just reading all the material and then we're leaving notes. And so whether you use that piece of software or some other mechanism, I think it's really important to be able to figure out how can you get the ideas out without it always just being the loudest person, and this is all stuff we've heard time and time again, but like it really actually matters, I think, is when you're in a world of intuition as opposed to data. So that's my thought. Cool. All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much for listening to what you have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. That's the end of the Leadership Collective programming. There is a fantastic keynote that's going to happen downstairs. I'd make your way down there now, beat the crowds, that kind of thing. Obviously, the lounge is still available for just a little bit longer, I believe. And then hope you all had a great time at 2024's Leadership Collective.
Thank you.